And joining us from Virginia is Dr. Donald Jensen, the Associate Fellow at the Gino Germani Institute and adjacent professor at Johns Hopkins University, a veteran U.S. diplomat and an analyst of Russia and information warfare. He has followed the transformation of Europe's defense order for decades. Dr. Jensen, thank you for joining us and welcome to In Focus. The foreign policy proposal envisions Ukraine as a security guarantor for the Baltic states, a radical shift in Europe's architecture. How feasible, realistically, is this idea, both militarily and politically?
Thank you for having me. I read the article with great interest, and let me say that that's certainly the direction of developments in European security, but I would hesitate perhaps to be as expansive as the author was and talks about a radical change. I don't think it's a radical change. It's a much needed realistic change to address the Russian threat. But again, it's not going to replace European security architecture, primarily NATO as it exists today. What you're seeing is the development, let's call them, of sub-communities of security, the one you mentioned, and those I think are designed to augment the deterrent capabilities of NATO, particularly because, let's be frank, the U.S. and NATO can provide, let's say, export some security needs to Ukraine that it can't provide on its own. Even, as you say, Ukraine has become a high-powered, modern, very capable armed forces. There are still things it lacks. I think that what you're seeing now is a number of trends, but in this regard, what you're seeing now is the complementarity of Ukraine's skills, Ukraine's needs, as well as the security needs of the countries that signed the agreement you mentioned, Northern Europe, by the way, and not coincidentally. So you're seeing these sub-communities emerge within the general NATO framework, and I think that's a very important and needed thing. Certainly, I would guess the U.S. administration agrees, because you've also seen the Trump administration really tilt more to European security concerns in recent months as the president seems to be frustrated by Putin's unwillingness to compromise on a peace settlement.
Yes, well, Trump's skepticism towards NATO and his calls to reduce the US troops in Europe have rattled allies. Definitely. But do you believe that Europe now is ready or forced to operate without America's umbrella?
I think Europe would prefer to work without it. There's not one Europe, of course, there are many Europes, but I do not think they are yet capable of doing so. Some of the stuff that the U.S. sells now to NATO for transfer to Ukraine for purchase, excuse me, are items that Europe cannot produce on its own. And I would be, if I could venture into security, a sensitive security topic, I think that the experience of the Ukrainian military and, frankly, the U.S. Armed Forces is very valuable in terms of NATO and its members achieving the security needs that it needs and that it wants. And I think there is some question about some of the NATO, forgive me for being too critical, some question about the efficiency of some of the NATO membership and their armed forces. While you have very capable armies like Poland, small ones in the Baltics, and Norway, and the new contributions from Finland and Sweden, those contributions are not uniformly excellent as you go across the alliance. And I would add, since you were talking about European populism earlier, the political dimension has to be kept in mind, where a strong stance against Moscow in some quarters is still regarded with some skepticism, and that's of course encouraged by Russia's very, very active hybrid warfare campaigns in domestic politics in places like Germany and France and Italy, which has become tougher than it has been. So Russia is very much playing a hybrid game here, where information, disinformation, the bribing of politicians, the capitalization of domestic social concerns in a number of European countries provides a ripe opportunity for Russia to move and to exploit. And certainly the immigration crisis, wherever it is in Europe, is something the Russians watch very closely and do try to exploit. I mean, after all, not a few years ago, they were they being the Kremlin, helped instrumentalize the Polish-Belarus border crisis, you may remember. That is encouraged by Russia because Russia knows what it cannot achieve on the battlefield, it can sometimes achieve with propaganda, with money, and with other kinds of pressures, using the vulnerabilities of these European societies to get what they want.
Mm-hmm.
And what they want is to break up the West, and what they want is to break up the Western alliance so they can expand their influence in their former neighborhood and beyond.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go back to Ukraine, where you've mentioned that they still fall short. However, they want to project that image of the de facto defender of Europe, tying down Russian forces and testing NATO weapons in real combat. What lessons is Europe drawing from Ukraine's battlefield innovations then, especially in drone and hybrid warfare?
Exactly, you pinpointed exactly. Ukraine now has more experience than almost battlefield experience than in almost any country in the world, first of all. Second, if you follow the military developments closely, Ukraine is we're constantly experimenting and reorganizing their division and core military structures to best address the threat. You mentioned drones, but they're very strong in other things as well. But they do lack intelligence, and that's what the U.S. has been providing. They do lack some high-tech equipment, which the U.S. has been providing. And I think you probably read last week, President Zelensky's trip through Scandinavia was widely heralded as the beginning of a new relationship with those four countries. The Swedes promised to sell very capable high-tech jet fighters to Ukraine, and it helps Ukraine knowing that there are the coalition of the willing is expanding, and certainly a lot of these countries, alarmed by Russia's adventurism and aggressiveness, a lot of these countries now see the threat for the first time. Finland and Sweden in particular, but certainly Norway as well. Norway has taken the lead on a lot of these initiatives. They are a NATO member, more long-standing than their neighbors to the east, but it's coming together in a way that I think can only please dismay Moscow and please Ukraine. However, we have to keep in mind the shortcomings of military capability at the moment, which are still significant.
Mm-hmm. Well, then what about Russia? Could such a pact provoke direct confrontation, pushing Russia to get NATO's resolve in the Baltics, as many analysts fear?
Well, yes, I think so. I think so. Basically, I don't want to be I want to be critical of Putin. Let's put it this way. Putin never calculated on February 20th, 2022, all of this happening. NATO was not a threat. It's not a threat now, but NATO is responding to Russian provocations in Ukraine and elsewhere. This is a gross miscalculation by the Russian leadership. It's devastated the Russian economy. It's caused more than 1 million casualties. Putin never accounted for any of this. Now, what political ramifications this might have down the line, who's to say? But Russia, having spent billions of dollars reforming its military from 2006 and 7 to the beginning of this war, now sees in many ways it's all for naught. They've gone back to traditional, let's call it czarist ways of fighting, massive attacks, massive casualties, and hoping just to grind down the opponent. It may work, but that requires to resist a very strong resolve from the countries we mentioned here in this conversation, from the UK, and certainly from the United States as well. And we're seeing them coming together, that is, this coalition of Western powers to help Ukraine. There are still problems. We see no more talk about an armed forces in Ukraine from the West, but Ukraine is surprisingly, despite all the obstacles, at least for now, holding its own, and we'll see what happens as the months continue.
Yes, well, that's one of the results of this conflict, that Ukraine's war economy has created a fast-evolving defense industry. Could this industrial capacity make Ukraine indispensable to Europe's future security ecosystem?
It certainly could. I think if you look at the drone issue you mentioned, this is a completely different dimension to warfare in Europe that nobody paid much attention to 4 years ago. You remember the first months of the war were dominated by artillery battles and comparisons to World War I. That's not true. Ukraine has more or less kept Russia at bay by relatively scarce troop deployments, but massive defense lines that are electronic, that are based on drone warfare. Again, these are lessons the Europeans can learn from. Frankly, the U.S. can learn from, and they're studying them very closely. But let me add, you make an excellent point. Let me add one more thing, which is to say, Ukrainian military-industrial complex is developing and thriving. But they do need investment. We had just last week here a delegation of Ukrainian businesses here trying to raise private support for Ukrainians' further military capabilities. I assume that's happening in the UK and Germany and France as well. So it's a two-way street. But 3 years ago, we didn't think it was a two-way street at all. We thought it was a one-way street. And it turns out we're learning a lot from Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Well, if Europe then truly enters a post-American security era, what will define it? Is it solidarity among equals or a scramble for survival against a resurgent Russia?
Well, I think we can, excuse me, we have to, what will define it will be more than one thing. One will be the role of China. As we say, Russia is inexorably, and perhaps against its own best interests, moving toward China, which is enabling the war by providing Russia high-tech weaponry, computer technology, and so forth. That will be one. And that's not a coincidence that President Trump has been in the Far East this week, because he's sounding out China, some agreements, they came to some agreements and so forth. That will be number one. Number two will be the resilience of, I would say, not just the European governments, but European populations. And I think I'm glad to talk to you about this just after your comments about your discussion earlier about European populism. There's a lot of discontent, not a majority, but a lot of discontent in some countries who feel their own domestic needs are neglected, migration being one of them, but also think that supporting Ukrainian struggle against Russia is not worth the candle. Well, it is worth the candle, but we talked about leadership in your previous segment. What we need is strong, enlightened European leaders to explain the threat that Russia poses, to explain how a strategy, how we can resist it and build resilience. And that, I think, will be supported by the majority of the people in the European allies and NATO.
Yes. Dr. Donald Jensen, thank you very much, sir, for your insights and for joining us here on In Focus. Europe's defense is now is no longer actually an Atlantic promise. It is now a continental responsibility. From London's polarized politics to Europe's militarized periphery. Tonight's stories trace the same theme: trust in decline. In Britain, it's the trust between citizens and their leaders. In Europe, it's the trust between allies and protectors. Both reveal a continent searching for conviction, moral, political, and strategic. I'm Hani Saif. Thank you for joining us.